In this movie, we'll look at the basic elements of notation in deployment diagrams. The fundamental unit in deployment diagrams is a node, so we'll start with nodes. Then we'll look at devices, which are a subtype of node, and finally at communication paths, which link nodes or devices. A node is a generic computational resource in a system. There are two subtypes of nodes: devices, which we'll see in this movie, and execution environments, which we'll see in the next. A node is a resource onto which you can deploy software artifacts. A node is shown by a cuboid, or a perspective view of a cube, as it's described in the UML specification. The name of the node is usually shown towards the top. We can show nodes in diagrams as types or instances. As a type, a node represents a specification of the type of resource that is required for the system, for example, an application server. As an instance, a node represents a specific resource, such as the application server named applin27. A device represents a physical hardware device onto which you can deploy software artifacts. Device is a subtype of node. Devices can be complex and consist of other devices, which can be shown by nesting or composition. A device is shown as the same cuboid shape as a node, but with the stereotype device at the top. As with nodes, devices can be types or instances. In his book Elements of UML2 Style, Scott Ambler suggests that you should assume that nodes are physical devices. In my experience, it's usually not necessary to distinguish between nodes and devices, though you can regard a node as more generic. I'll use both in this movie to illustrate the use of both. A communication path is an association between nodes or devices by which they exchange signals or messages. Typically, it represents some kind of network connection, but it could equally be something like a USB cable between a laptop and a phone. A communication path is shown as an association between two nodes or devices. The type of communication supported, or the communication protocol, is shown as a stereotype alongside the communication path, as with TCP/IP in this diagram. Let's create a deployment diagram in Enterprise Architect to try this out. Here's the home automation model. I'm going to add a new view called Deployment View. So, I add a view to the project by right-clicking on Home Automation, selecting Add, and Add View. It will be a deployment view, so I'll check that radio button, and I'm just going to call it Deployment View. Now I'll add a package and call it Home Network and create a deployment diagram in it. I right-click on Deployment View, select Add a Package. I'm going to call it Home Network. I'm going to create a diagram, and the diagram is a deployment diagram. Deployment diagrams are a UML structural diagram, and I select Deployment here. Right, I'll start by adding a node and calling it Controller. This will represent the computer that controls the home automation system. So I click on Node in the toolbox and click on the diagram. I'll call it Controller. I'll also add a node for the X10 network. I'm adding this as a node to avoid having many point-to-point connections between all the nodes and devices in the diagram. If my purpose was to model the network in detail, then I could show the various firewalls, switches, and routers in the network as nodes or devices. However, I just want to show the network here as a black box, so I don't model the detail. I add the node and call it X10 network. Now I'll add some devices. We'll start with a PC used for interacting with the controller through the use case Directly Control Device via Browser. I click on Device in the toolbox and then on the diagram. I'll call it PC Client. Now I'll add a sensor called Induction Sensor. And I'll add a couple of devices that are controlled by the network: on-off device and open-close device. The fact that I've called the things being controlled in the system devices is just coincidence. Here in the deployment diagram, these elements represent the actual physical devices, whereas in the class diagram, on-off device and open-close device are software representations of those devices. Communication paths link up the different nodes and devices. To add a communication path, I can use the quick linker or the toolbox. In the deployment relationships part of the toolbox, it's the arrow with CP next to it. I'll add a communication path between PC Client and Controller. In Enterprise Architect, it adds it as a directed communication path. I don't want it to be directed, so I'll right-click on it, select Advanced, Change Direction, and Unspecified. You can see it's removed the arrowhead. I want to stereotype this communication path as TCP/IP. So I open its properties, and over on the right of the dialog, there's a pane for setting connector properties, and I type TCP/IP into the stereotype field. You can see the stereotype underneath the communication path now. All the other connections will be X10, so I'll add communication paths with a quick linker between controller and X10 network, and then between X10 network and the sensor and two devices. They all need to be non-directional, and I want to stereotype them all as X10. Because I've already added the stereotype X10, it will now appear in the list of possible stereotypes that I can select as a drop-down here. So, we've created a basic deployment diagram using types. In the next movie, we'll use instances, as well as looking at how software is shown in deployment diagrams.